Okay, my YouTube people, this is going to be a technical video on how to troubleshoot your charging system, and this will cover any Harley that has an alternator style charging system. So before you start troubleshooting your charging system, you want to make sure that you're not having another issue that looks like a charging system problem when it's really not. So you want to make sure that you don't have a starter problem. You know, a starter problem can look like a battery issue or a charging issue when it's really not. And also you want to make sure you have really good battery cables. You want to charge your battery before you start testing. And you also want to load test your battery. You want to check that your battery connections are good on both ends. They're clean and especially tight. You want to make sure that where the negative battery connects to the frame is very clean. A lot of times I use a star washer that kind of bites into both the cable and the frame for that. You want to measure your battery voltage when your bike is not running, and it should be 12 volts or more. So when you start the motorcycle, you want to measure the battery again, and at idle it should basically be 13.3 volts or very close to that. Once you run the engine up to about 2,000 RPMs, the voltage should be anywhere from 13.3 volts to 14.5 volts. The voltage should never be more than 15 volts or you have issues. If the battery's dying when your bike's not running, you either have a bad battery or you have some kind of drain on the battery, and it's important to find that, because again, that can look like a battery problem or it can be a pain to find. So with the key in the off position, you want to remove your negative battery cable and you want to put an amp meter in series with it. Now most amp meters can't handle a lot of amperage depending on what kind of amp meter you have. So you definitely don't want to try and crank the bike with the amp meter in series with it. They also have clip-on amp meters, but for troubleshooting drainage problems of your battery, you really want an amp meter in series with it. Now, when the amp meter's in series with it, there should be no more than 3 milliamps. And 3 milliamps is 0.003 of 1 amp. If there's more than that amount, you have a drain. First thing you want to do when looking for a drain problem is remove the voltage regulator output wire from the battery and check it again. If it's now 0 milliamps, you have a bad voltage regulator. If you still have a draw with the voltage regulator removed, you have a problem outside your charging system, whereas something else is drawing on it and you have to go find that to fix that. So after you've done all these things, you've eliminated that it's a battery problem, you've eliminated it's not the voltage regulator draining the battery, it's not your cables, then you want to check the stator. This is the stator, and this is what a stator looks like. You have 2 wires coming off the stator. Now, exactly what is a stator? This wire goes in here, and it wraps around this, and then a single wire wraps around this one, goes to the next one, wraps around, and that single wire just keeps wrapping around these, back to this one. It's just a coil of wire. If you measure from these 2 points, you should have very, very low resistance. The factory spec on these is about 0.1 to 0.2 ohms. If it's lower than 0.1, then it's shorted, and if it's higher, it's either open, starting to open, or if it's infinite, then it's completely open. And let's take a look at what this one looks like. So when your stator is inside your motorcycle, this is underneath the crankshaft on the primary side of your motorcycle, and generally these come out right in front of the engine on the left side, right near the front of your primary. So this is the primary side of my Road King. They would be under right here, mounted to the crankshaft, and then those wires come out right there. It's that wires that come out and go over here to the voltage regulator. You can see it easier on my chopper. Now on my chopper I don't have a connector. I just have the wires and they're ran straight back. The rectifier regulator is underneath the transmission on this bike. I do have that RTV'd so water can't get in there. You just can't really see it. You want to set your meter to resistance, and I've stated this in past videos. Anytime you're using any kind of ohm meter, first thing you want to do, or a voltmeter or anything else, you want to check the resistance of your wires. So right now I'm at 0.4 ohms. And I have 0.5 ohms now. And that's what it's supposed to be, 0.1 to 0.2 ohms. The next check you should do on your stator when it's on your bike is check it to ground. Now the best way to do that is connect one lead while you're on ohms on your meter. You connect one lead to the battery negative, or get a good ground somewhere on the engine, and then essentially this is ground because it's bolted through these holes, and you check the lead and make sure that it's infinite like you see here, no resistance at all. And you can always check the other one, and it should always be infinite to ground. Now what I've seen happen to these is sometimes the regulator rectifier goes bad, or if you have a bad battery, it puts a heavy load on your charging system, and it'll generally cause charging problems with the charging system. So anytime your battery's starting to go bad, it's best to replace it right away. Don't keep trickle charging it and then riding it, and if it's like getting weak, because the next time you run it while you're riding it, it's causing a heavy load on your charging system, which ends up killing it. You can kind of see that's probably what happened to this one, because they coat this wire with a coating, and now you can see it's real dark. That coating has gotten dark from heat. And generally what I've seen happen is when you have one of these that are burnt, the first thing you do is when you open the cover to your primary, they will stink really bad, because when this coating burns, it's very smelly. Then you'll pull it out and you'll actually see, like, these will be black, and you'll probably be able to see where it's open. If not, you'll probably be able to tell which one actually opened. So I've also seen where not only did the wire open, but it came over here, it'll short out onto this metal or short out onto the engine case, and when you measure from one side to ground, you'll see that it's 0 ohms, and that's because the wire shorted out. So that's the way to check your stator without even having to take it out of the motorcycle or anything like that. But if you find that you have a stator problem, if it's burned, as soon as you open the primary cover, you will know that your stator is burned. You can believe that. So let's talk about what comes out of the stator. Coming out of the stator is AC. When you're checking this, you take the plug that's there and you disconnect it. You take your meter and you set it to AC volts. You should have 16 to 20 volts AC for every 1,000 RPMs. While it's idling, you connect it to your stator output leads, and you should have that 16 to 20 volts while it's idling. And then if you can permanently connect your leads or have somebody else rev the bike up for you, then you should have the proper amount of voltage. This stator is mounted on the left side of your motorcycle under the primary cover, and it has the rotor sits over top of it. This rotor is splined to the crankshaft on the left hand side of the bike and sits over top of this, and here up against this would be your primary chain. So the rotor has these magnets that are glued to the outside steel housing, and when they spin around the stator, that's what causes your AC voltage. And the two things I've seen, or the three things I've seen with the rotors is, one is these magnets, sometimes if there's a lot of heat, they'll come unglued, and when they come unglued, they'll fall in here and this thing will crush and tear it up. And you'll come and you'll open this up and all these magnets, or most of them, will be damaged heavily. Also, what I've seen, if the nut comes loose that holds all this on, this will cause these splines to wear, and it'll eventually just take the splines completely off. So you could have a charging system problem where your stator's good, your rotor magnets are good, but the splines eaten out of here, and then you need a new rotor so it's got a good set of splines, and you should be checking those splines anytime you have this off. They generally say that when you're replacing the voltage regulator that you should replace the stator and the rotor with it. I don't normally do that. I normally just replace what's bad. But that's how to check your stator. So the newer Harleys actually have 3 wires, not 2. That's how the older Japanese dirt bikes have been for a long time, where they have 3 wires. If you have 3 wires, it's the same check. You check from this wire to this wire, and it should be 0.1 to 0.2 ohms. You should check this wire to this wire. It should be the same resistance, and then your outside wire should be the same resistance. And when that happens, your regulator will have wires accordingly. This is a 2-wire regulator. These 2 wires have a plug, and it plugs into the stator like so. And it doesn't matter which one goes where, because it's AC coming out. So these 2 have to go to the rectifier regulator that way. This single wire out of the middle of the rectifier regulator goes to the battery. And the 3 wires the same way. You're going to have 3 AC wires, and you're going to have 1 DC wire output. You could also have a ground wire. Now this regulator in particular grounds through the case. So I always make sure that this is really clean, and I also make sure the backside's really clean. And then I put a star washer underneath the bolts here to make sure I have a very good ground connection. Harley's different charging systems can have different output current. The more of these poles that are on the stator will give you more current. And then also, depending on the rectifier regulator, it's rated for the amount of current that the stator is going to put out. So to troubleshoot the rectifier regulator, you want to get a clamp-on amp meter. And that clamp-on amp meter looks like this. And then you want to take and clamp it over top of the negative battery cable. With the stator disconnected, you want to start the motorcycle. You want to turn on all of your bike's electrics. You want to turn on the high beam. If you have fog lamps, you want to turn those on. If you have a radio, you want to turn it on. And then record the amps that your motorcycle's drawing at that time. Again, that's with the stator disconnected. After you shut the motorcycle off, you want to reconnect your stator, and you want to put your clamp-on amp meter over top of the output of the rectifier regulator, like this. Now you start your motorcycle, turn on the same power draws as you did before. In other words, high beam, fog lamps, radio if you have it, and record that value. The rectifier regulator output should be higher than the battery output was. Now the rectifier regulator is not only putting out enough current for all of the accessories that you have on, but it's also charging the battery too. So you take those 2 numbers, and this one over the output of the rectifier regulator should be higher than just the negative battery cable was. When you do this check, if it's not the case that this is putting out slightly more, then your rectifier regulator is bad, and it's the battery running the system. So that's the 2 checks for checking this. Check to make sure it's not drawing when the bike's off, and that it's putting out more current than just the battery is alone with the motorcycle running. Once you do these steps, you'll know exactly what your problem with your charging system is. Keep in mind that you could always have more than one problem. If your bike has some kind of short and it's drawing so much current through the rectifier regulator that it damages it, but in the process it can also damage your stator, well, you might not have the AC output, and when you get this replaced, you might find you're still not charging. Then it's your regulator. And that's why sometimes they tell you just to replace both at the same time. I guess it's for troubleshooting reasons, or they're worried about the fact that you already did damage to both. Again, I only replace one at a time. Looking at a diagram of the charging system, this will go over what we just talked about. You want to make sure that you load test your battery and that your battery's good. So I'll just put a little OK there. You also need to have a good starter. So we'll put OK there with your starter. You need to check that both ends of your cables, the connections, are clean and tight. Next thing you need to do is check your wiring on any circuit breakers, that it's tight and they're clean. If it is that your battery's dying when your motorcycle shut off, the check for that is you put an amp meter in series with your negative battery cable. You disconnect that battery cable from the battery, you connect it to one side of your amp meter, and then you put the other side of your amp meter to the battery. With the motorcycle off, there should be less than 3 milliamps draw. It has to be all connected, and you look for that draw. If there's more than 3 milliamps or 0.003 of 1 amp, then your rectifier regulator is bad. So now you connect the negative battery cable back up to the battery. You come over here, and before you even start the bike, you take this plug and undo your rectifier regulator from your stator. At that point, you want to go from one side of the stator with an ohm meter, and then the other side of your ohm meter goes to ground. That's a universal electronic symbol for ground. And you check it, and it should be infinite, no resistance. Now you check from the other side to ground, and there should be no resistance, infinite resistance to ground. The last thing you want to do is you want to take your meter with it disconnected and put one lead on one wire and then one lead on the other wire, and check that when you measure through this, it's 0.1 to 0.2 ohms at the most. If you have a 3-wire system, pick any of the two and measure those two. Take the next two, measure those two, and then take the last two in that combination and measure that, and each one of those three should be less than 0.1 to 0.2 ohms. That checks your stator inside the motorcycle. With everything connected up as normal except for the plug, you leave the plug disconnected, you take your meter, AC volts, and you put one wire to one pin of the stator and one wire to the other pin, and you should have 16 to 20 volts AC per 1000 RPM. So if you go to 2000, it's 32 to 40 volts. It's pretty simple, and you should rev it up to 2000 and check it. Make sure the voltage is going up and down. The last test you want to do is to check your rectifier regulator. And the way you do that is you take and disconnect the stator from it, and you start your motorcycle. After it's running, you want to take a clamp on amp meter and put it around the negative battery cable. You want to turn on all your draws in your charging system that you can. The high beam, the radio, maybe even press on the handbrake to get the brake light in the back on, along with the running lights, any fog lights. You measure that DC current. That's a clamp on amp meter for DC current. And let's just say that is 5.2 amps DC. Okay? You record that number, 5.2. And now you shut the motorcycle off. You take and you reconnect the stator up to the rectifier regulator. You take that amp meter that you have, that clamp on amp meter, and now you put it here. Clamp it on that wire that comes from the rectifier regulator over to the battery. It could hook to the starter, or it could hook directly to the battery. A lot of times they hook it to the starter, so there's not too many connections at the battery. Now, you start your motorcycle and you turn on the exact same accessories as you had before when you drew 5.2 amps DC. It should now have something greater than 5.2 amps DC out of the charging system, because now you have all your accessories, plus you are charging the battery. So let's say with your clamp on amp meter on DC right here, you now read 5.7 amps DC. Now you know that your voltage rectifier regulator is working, because it is putting out more than your system is drawing. And that is how you check your system. If it's not putting more out, your voltage regulator is bad. You already checked that the stator's good because you saw the AC coming out. And that's how you troubleshoot your charging system. I'm going to do a follow-up video where I actually show you what this looks like on a motorcycle that happens to be charging just fine, but what everything looks like using the meter and what I described. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. I appreciate it, and thank you for watching.